They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But mine was served with a side of boardroom humiliation and a garnish of career destruction. The moment I walked into that final meeting, watching Marcus Blackwood's face drain of color as he realized what I'd done, I knew every sleepless night of planning had been worth it. But let me start from the beginning. When I was still naive enough to believe that hard work and integrity mattered more than last names and nepotism. My name is Amelia Torres, and 6 months ago, I was the rising star of Meridian Financial Solutions, fresh out of my MBA program. I'd landed what I thought was my dream job as a senior analyst in their investment division. At 28, I was ambitious, driven, and foolishly optimistic about corporate America's commitment to meritocracy. The first red flag should have been the way Marcus Blackwood looked at me during my initial team meeting. Not the way men typically looked at me. I was used to that unfortunate reality of being a woman in finance. No, this was different. This was the look of someone who'd already decided I didn't belong, who saw my presence as a personal affront to the natural order of things. Marcus was the CEO's son, a fact that everyone pretended didn't matter while simultaneously treating him like corporate royalty. At 32, he should have been my peer. But his Harvard MBA and family connections had fast-tracked him to vice president of strategic investments. Technically, he wasn't my direct supervisor, but his influence permeated every corner of our department. I should have seen it coming. The subtle undermining, the way my ideas were dismissed in meetings only to be presented by someone else weeks later, the mysterious exclusion from key client calls. But I was too focused on proving myself, too busy working 16-hour days and producing results that spoke for themselves. The clients loved me. My portfolio consistently outperformed expectations. I'd identified 3 major market opportunities that generated millions in revenue for the company. By any objective measure, I was succeeding beyond anyone's wildest dreams. That's exactly why Marcus wanted me gone. The beginning of the end came during the quarterly review cycle. I'd been expecting a promotion. Everyone had been expecting it. My direct supervisor, Tom Harrington, had practically guaranteed it. The senior vice president position in the emerging markets division was mine for the taking. Instead, I watched from the conference room as Marcus announced that the position would be going to Bradley Thornton, a mediocre analyst who'd been with the company for barely 8 months. Bradley, who happened to be Marcus's former fraternity brother. Bradley, whose biggest accomplishment was not spilling coffee on his keyboard during presentations. "I'm sure you understand," Tom said to me afterward, his eyes avoiding mine. "Sometimes these decisions are about fit, not just performance." Fit. That word would haunt me for weeks. I threw myself into my work with renewed vigor, determined to prove that this was just a temporary setback. I led the team that secured the Morrison Industries account, worth $40 million. I identified the discrepancies in the Patterson merger that saved the company from a potential lawsuit. I worked weekends, holidays, and every waking moment in between. None of it mattered. The second blow came 3 months later. Budget cuts, they said. Restructuring. I was being transferred to the compliance department, a lateral move that everyone knew was corporate purgatory, a place where promising careers went to die. "It's temporary," Tom assured me, but we both knew he was lying. I should have quit then. Should have taken my impressive resume and walked straight to a competitor. But I was angry now. And angry people make interesting decisions. That's when I started paying attention to the things I'd been too busy to notice before. I started noticing how Marcus's expense reports never seemed to get scrutinized the way everyone else's did. How he was always traveling to conferences in locations that seemed more suited to vacation than professional development. How he had a habit of scheduling important meetings during times when certain people like me, were conveniently unavailable. I started noticing the patterns in his emails, the way he copied his father on communications that should have been routine, the way he positioned himself as the architect of successes he'd had nothing to do with. Most importantly, I started noticing the mistakes. See, Marcus had a problem. He was smart enough to know he wasn't the smartest person in the room, but too arrogant to let that stop him from acting like he was. He'd override decisions, ignore expert advice, and pushed through initiatives that looked good on paper but fell apart under scrutiny. The Castellano project was a perfect example. A mid-sized manufacturing company looking to expand into Southeast Asian markets. I'd done the preliminary analysis and recommended against the investment. The regulatory environment was too unstable. The local partnerships were questionable, and the projected returns were based on overly optimistic assumptions. Marcus overruled me. Not just overruled, he dismissed my concerns entirely, suggesting in front of the client that I was risk-averse and lacking in vision. The investment went through. 18 months and $12 million later, Castellano filed for bankruptcy protection. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was watching Marcus somehow spin the disaster as a learning experience, a calculated risk that hadn't paid off but demonstrated the company's innovative thinking. He faced no consequences, no accountability, no acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, he should have listened to the woman with the advanced degree in international finance. That's when I realized that playing by the rules was never going to work. The game was rigged, and I'd been too naive to see it. So I decided to change the rules. Step 1 was information gathering. I started building a comprehensive file on Marcus's decision-making patterns, his project outcomes, his expense reports, his communications. I became a student of his incompetence, documenting every questionable choice and its inevitable consequences. The beauty of working in compliance is that nobody pays attention to what you're doing. They assume you're buried in regulatory paperwork and audit preparations. What they don't realize is that compliance gives you access to everything, every transaction, every approval, every decision that flows through the company. I discovered that Marcus had been inflating his project success rates by cherry-picking metrics and excluding failed initiatives from his performance reviews. I found expense reports that couldn't possibly be legitimate, unless he'd somehow figured out how to be in 2 cities simultaneously. I uncovered emails where he'd taken credit for work done by his subordinates, sometimes copying and pasting their analyses word for word. But the real treasure was the Henderson deal. Henderson Industries was a family-owned chemical company looking to go public. They'd hired Meridian to handle the IPO, a prestigious assignment worth millions in fees. Marcus had positioned himself as the lead on the project, despite having no experience with public offerings. I'd been part of the initial team that analyzed Henderson's financials, and I'd spotted something troubling. Their environmental compliance records were spotty at best, and there were indications of ongoing EPA investigations that hadn't been disclosed. I'd flagged these concerns in my preliminary report, recommending a more thorough due diligence process. Marcus had buried my report. Not just ignored it, actively suppressed it. He'd directed the team to focus on other aspects of the analysis and had somehow convinced senior leadership that the environmental issues were minor and manageable. But I'd kept copies of everything, my original analysis, the follow-up research I'd done on my own time, the email chain where Marcus had explicitly instructed the team to not get bogged down in regulatory minutiae. The Henderson IPO launched on a Tuesday in November. The stock price soared in the first week, and Marcus was hailed as a visionary. He gave interviews to financial publications, talking about his innovative approach to emerging growth companies. The EPA announced their enforcement action against Henderson Industries on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks later. The stock price collapsed. Investors lost hundreds of millions. Several pension funds that had invested heavily in the IPO were devastated. The SEC opened an investigation into whether Meridian had properly disclosed the environmental risks. Marcus tried to contain the damage, but it was too late. The story was already spreading through the financial media. Questions were being asked about the due diligence process. Reporters were digging into Henderson's compliance history. That's when I made my move. I'd been preparing for this moment for months. I had copies of every document, every email, every analysis that showed Marcus had been aware of the environmental risks and had chosen to ignore them. I had evidence of his pattern of suppressing inconvenient information and inflating his success metrics. But I didn't go to the media first. I went to the SEC. The whistleblower complaint I filed was 87 pages long, meticulously documented, and devastating in its implications. I laid out a pattern of negligence and possible fraud, backed by hundreds of supporting documents. I showed how Marcus had systematically ignored expert advice, suppressed critical information, and misled both clients and regulators. The SEC investigation that followed was swift and brutal. They froze Henderson's assets, suspended trading in the company's stock, and opened a parallel investigation into Meridian's practices. Federal agents showed up at the office with search warrants, carting away boxes of documents and computer hard drives. Marcus tried to throw his team under the bus, claiming he'd relied on their analysis and hadn't been aware of the environmental issues. But I'd anticipated that strategy. Every document in my complaint was time-stamped and cross-referenced, showing exactly when Marcus had received what information and what he'd done with it. The civil lawsuit came next. Henderson's investors, led by a consortium of pension funds, filed a class action suit against both Henderson and Meridian. The plaintiff's attorneys had somehow gotten hold of my SEC complaint, completely legally, since whistleblower documents become part of the public record once the investigation begins. Marcus's name appeared 47 times in the legal filing. The board meeting where Marcus's fate was decided happened on a rainy Thursday in February. I wasn't supposed to be there, but Tom Harrington had asked me to attend as a witness. The company's lawyers wanted to make sure they had all the facts straight. I watched from the back of the room as Marcus tried to defend himself, his usual confidence replaced by desperation. He blamed his subordinates, claimed he'd been misled, suggested that the environmental issues were unforeseeable and that any competent analyst would have made the same decisions. That's when the lead attorney opened the folder containing my original analysis, the one Marcus had buried 9 months earlier, the one that had explicitly warned about the environmental risks and recommended against proceeding without further investigation. "Mr. Blackwood," the attorney said, his voice carefully neutral. "Are you saying you were unaware of these concerns?" Marcus's face went white. He looked around the room, his eyes finally landing on me. For a moment, I saw something like recognition there, not just of me, but of what I'd done. That analysis was preliminary," he stammered. "It wasn't. We had multiple reports. According to our records, you specifically instructed your team to disregard these environmental concerns. You told them not to get bogged down in regulatory minutiae. Do you recall that instruction?" The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus Blackwood resigned that afternoon. The press release cited strategic differences and wished him well in his future endeavors. But everyone in the industry knew what had really happened. Word travels fast in finance, and Marcus's name became synonymous with the Henderson disaster. The SEC fine against Meridian was $50 million. Marcus personally faced civil penalties that would likely bankrupt him. The criminal referral to the Department of Justice was still pending, but the word was that federal prosecutors were very interested in making an example of someone. As for me, the whistleblower reward was substantial, a percentage of the civil penalties that would set me up for life. But more importantly, I'd been vindicated. Every decision I'd made, every concern I'd raised, every piece of analysis I'd done had been proven correct. The new CEO, brought in to clean house after the Henderson scandal, offered me Marcus's old position, Vice President of Strategic Investments, with a salary that was double what I'd been making in compliance. I turned it down. Instead, I took a position with a competitor, one that had been trying to recruit me for months. They'd seen my work on the Henderson whistleblower complaint and knew exactly what kind of analyst I was. They wanted someone who wasn't afraid to ask difficult questions, who wouldn't be intimidated by pressure from above. My first day at Davidson & Associates, I walked into a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. My new business cards read, Senior Vice President, Due Diligence and Risk Assessment. My new salary was more than Marcus had been making at Meridian. But the real satisfaction came 6 months later. When I heard through the grapevine that Marcus was working at a small regional bank in Ohio, processing loan applications for small businesses. His Harvard MBA and family connections hadn't been enough to overcome the Henderson disaster. No reputable firm would touch him. Sometimes I wonder if I should feel guilty about what I did. After all, I'd destroyed a man's career, possibly his life. But then I remember all the investors who lost their retirement savings because Marcus couldn't be bothered to do his job properly. I remember the pension funds that had trusted Meridian to give them honest advice. I remember all the competent people who'd been passed over for promotion because they didn't have the right last name. Justice isn't always pretty, but it's necessary. The Henderson case became a cautionary tale in business schools, a perfect example of what happens when nepotism and incompetence intersect with high-stakes finance. I've been asked to speak about it at several conferences, always focusing on the importance of proper due diligence and the courage to speak truth to power. What I don't tell those audiences is how satisfying it was to watch Marcus's world crumble, how I savored every moment of his downfall, every headline that mentioned his name in connection with the scandal, how I kept a folder of press clippings about his disgrace, not out of malice, but as a reminder that sometimes the good guys do win. Revenge, it turns out, is best served with a side of regulatory compliance and a garnish of federal investigation. 6 months after joining Davidson and Associates, I was promoted again, this time to executive vice president with a seat on the executive committee. I was the youngest person ever to hold that position at the firm, and certainly the first to have gotten there by destroying her previous employer's golden boy. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had wanted me gone because he saw me as a threat to his position. He'd been right. I was a threat, just not in the way he'd imagined. I was a threat to incompetence, to nepotism, to the old boys club that had dominated finance for decades. I was a threat to anyone who thought they could coast on their connections while people like me did the actual work. And I was just getting started. The financial industry is full of Marcus Blackwoods, entitled, incompetent, and dangerous. Men who've never faced real consequences for their failures, who've never had to earn their positions the way the rest of us do. But things are changing. The Henderson case proved that whistleblowers can make a difference, that documentation and persistence can overcome even the most entrenched privilege. It proved that sometimes the system works. Not always, not often enough, but sometimes. And sometimes is enough to build a career on. Today, I run my own consulting firm, specializing in financial due diligence and regulatory compliance. My clients are institutional investors, pension funds, and government agencies, the kind of people who were hurt by the Henderson disaster and want to make sure it never happens again. I have a team of 12 analysts, most of them women, most of them brilliant, all of them hungry to prove themselves in an industry that too often overlooks their contributions. We've prevented 3 major financial disasters in the past year alone, catching problems that other firms missed or ignored. My office walls are covered with awards and recognition letters from regulatory agencies, client testimonials, and photos from speaking engagements. But in my desk drawer, I still keep that folder of press clippings about Marcus Blackwood's downfall. Not because I'm proud of what I did to him, though I am, but because it reminds me that individual actions can have enormous consequences. That one person with the right information and the courage to use it can change everything. Marcus Blackwood wanted me gone because he knew I was a threat. He was right. I just wish he'd realized how big a threat I really was. The Henderson case was just the beginning. There are more Marcus Blackwoods out there, more entitled incompetents who think their connections will protect them from the consequences of their actions. They think they're untouchable, that people like me will always be too afraid or too powerless to challenge them. They're wrong, and I'm going to spend the rest of my career proving it. After all, revenge may be a dish best served cold, but justice is a meal that never stops being satisfying. The game is rigged, but sometimes you can change the rules. Sometimes you can make the cheaters pay. Sometimes you can win. And when you do, the victory tastes even sweeter than the revenge.